everyone, and thanks for joining us today. On the agenda, is the consumer's ad tracking opt-out a way for fraudsters to opt in? So Schalk, Jill, and Raj, thanks for making the time to have a really important and interesting conversation with me today.
Happy to be here.
All right. It's June. I feel like it's time to mix things up a little bit. So let's not wait until the end of our conversation to answer the question that I just raised. To give you a little bit of time to think about your answer, let me put a little bit of context around it. So last year, Apple implemented app tracking transparency, which requires users to grant permission to be tracked by the apps that they use on iPhones and other Apple devices. It's reported that 40% of consumers have said, no, thank you, I don't want to be tracked. Privacy experts say that's their right. It's all about protecting consumer privacy, something obviously that consumers value. Fraud and security experts say not so fast. It's probably opening a loophole for fraudsters to exploit an unintended consequence of consumer privacy. So to start us off, who's right? Privacy experts, fraud experts? And Joe, I'm hoping you can start us off.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. First of all, I think privacy is very good, right? And we need to make sure that we put the privacy in the hands of the consumer. And from a fraudster perspective, they're going to find loopholes, right? They're always looking for loopholes in the system. I think the big thing is that we need to make sure that whatever tools that we have in place, that we are looking holistically, like we have enough intelligence, and we are looking at a lot of data. We're not only looking at, when a consumer is coming into a mobile application or an online website, we're not only looking at the device that they're interacting with, but we're looking at how they're interacting, right? Whether they give you the consent or not, we're looking at how they are interacting with your mobile application or your website. So I think, allowing the consumers to have the ability to opt out is fine, but you need to make sure that you are looking holistically and have the tools in place to validate that you know who the users are.
But we'll talk about how consumers feel about security, privacy, and how that affects their trust in financial institutions. Raj, I'd love to get your thoughts on that. What do you think?
No, I think I agree with a lot of what Jill was saying. I think it's really important that there is a choice. I think, and more important than just choice, it's really an educated and informed choice. The criminals know more about the tracking tools because they have a vested interest in learning about it, right? Sure. Most of us in our daily lives, that's not something that's significant. So we're not going to be as deeply conversant in that, what data is being tracked, what information is being shared, et cetera. And so as a result, I think we have an obligation to make sure that we're providing the information for our customers to make that informed choice of what's happening and why and how it's being used. I think really technology doesn't have a conscience one way or the other. I think it's really an obligation for all of us on thinking critically, how do we use that technology? How are we applying it? Are we doing it in a responsible way, and making sure that we're transparent, not necessarily into the minute details of how it's used, but what is the broad brushes? Right. Are we using somebody's, to use a simplistic example, email for spam, or are we sending them, critical information that's important for, their financial transactions or something like that, that may be regulatory in nature, right? So there's can be a wide range of how tracking tools are utilized. And so I think making sure that we're providing the information for that informed choice and consent is really the crux of it.
I think that's right, because I think, consumers obviously know that their information is valuable, And so I think that they fear that it's going to be used in a way that is spammy and not necessarily in a way that is helpful, because all of our inboxes are getting increasingly clogged day by day with with emails that tell us about things we don't really care about. But Schalk, I'd love to get your thoughts on that question.
Yeah, Karen, I think I want to be a bit controversial and say that I'm in two minds here. Obviously privacy is super important, but the question that I'm battling with is, a lot of things that customers say no to or have the ability to say no to are super important.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to give you an example. I was watching a YouTube video just out of curiosity about what are the top apps that you immediately, or settings rather, that you immediately have to switch off. And these guys were on about number one is location from your bank. Why does your bank want to track your location? And I was like, okay, well, I actually know why they want to do that.
Yep.
It's not for nefarious reasons.
Yep.
It's pretty simple. If your credit card transaction, as an example, is if a transaction is being processed, the bank can have a look and say, or MasterCard or somebody like, listen, is this person at their home or their usual location? And if the answer is they're there, but the transaction is from somewhere else, then hang on, red flag. Mm-hmm. So a lot of these things have got very good reason. And that's the slippery slope. What do you actually allow? And with a lot of operating systems, customers simply don't understand. They have the ability to just say no to these things. So tracking of information and tools that are actually super important in the ability to allow companies to protect those very same customers are being seen as privacy invasion, and that's the ultimate battle that I'm unsure of how to solve. Ultimately, it is the privacy versus these things are pretty important, and it's actually not a privacy risk. So and that education out there. So in two minds, how do we solve this problem? How do we get it to the market that listen, location is not going to be sold to somebody to do something with. This is actually protecting you.
Right. You're right. You're right about that point, because I do think that it isn't necessarily that straightforward. I mean, there's nuances to all of these things, as you point out, because what consumers also don't want is to be denied the ability to transact or to have access to their accounts because they've switched a setting and it declines a transaction or
it's a lot more friction.
Yep.
A lot more friction, because all of a sudden we don't know who you are, or we don't know where you are. We're seeing these transactions that make no sense, and we either block it. We being whoever is in charge of the issuing or the card network, or we make you jump through hoops. Whereas a simple thing that you perceive as a customer as being privacy on the other side can make it so much more seamless. So those are the things that we need to figure out how to actually land.
So let's transition to that, because we've done some work with Entersekt on trying to get an understanding of the relationship between consumers and their interest in securing their transactions and their activities with the accounts that they have online, and what relationship that has with the trust they have in their financial institutions. And I think what's interesting to me is that consumers, I mean, they of course want it all. They want security, they want convenience, but the relationship between the ability to deliver both is a real input into how trusted that institution is by that consumer. In fact, 83% of consumers say that digital security has a huge impact on how they think about the trust that they have in their financial services provider. It also suggests that consumers are open to something other than the traditional ways of authenticating themselves, which, I laughed at the statistic. 6 out of 10 consumers said they're open to something other than a password. Why isn't that 10 out of 10? Does anybody really like the password? I mean, maybe they do because it's the only thing they know, but anyway, I mean, certainly consumers are open to different ways. And I think to the point, Schalk, that you raised, which is, how do we use tools and technology to be as seamless and invisible to the consumer as possible, while still doing the job that financial institutions want to do, which is to protect the consumer and the relying party. Raj, from your perspective, what stands in the way of aligning security and convenience with alternative ways of authenticating consumers?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question because for many years, security and convenience have been kind of antonyms, right? They've been at odds
Yeah,
with
for
each
sure.
other. And so, Karen, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
All right, great. So yeah, security and convenience. I've been at loggerheads, right? It's one you want to be more secure, you have to be less convenient, and vice versa. And I think we're getting into a really interesting space now where the technology has evolved, and there's really opportunities to use security techniques that are also going to be less friction when we believe that there is lower risk. And I think a lot of that has to do with being much more intelligent and nuanced about how we are able to measure risk, how we're able to use data to try to understand what's typical behaviors, atypical behaviors. I think biometrics is a big component of this as well. Biometrics provides an opportunity to strengthen security, but it's also easier to use a thumbprint or a face scan than it is to remember a password to get access to a site. So I think a lot of these technologies now are providing both security and convenience. It's not one at the expense of the other. And I think we're looking to introduce that. We've already done a number of things on our platforms around that and continue to focus on how do we do that, especially when we believe there's low risk. We understand this is a typical transaction, typical user, right? We're not going to have as much friction as if we see something unusual that we might ask for an additional validation or confirmation through a different channel, et cetera.
Jill, from your perspective, what's on the critical path to getting to the end state, which is what Raj just described, the ability to use technology and tools in a way that isn't intrusive but effective?
Yeah, I mean, I think the critical path is having the right intelligence, right? And having the right information, the right tools to gather that information. It's interesting because new data last year, we saw that 85% of the clients that use new data services were trusted, right? They were actually the real user. And we were able to determine that not only based on their device information, but also their behavioral patterns and so on and so forth. But more than likely, a lot of those customers, experience some level of friction, right? And if those are actually trusted customers and we could, safeguard them through that user experience so that they have a better experience, you can just imagine the additional loyalty and and commitment you would get from those customers. So I think the critical thing is just having that level of information, and you can't have just you can't just look at device, right? You can't just have a bot detection tool. You have to have all of these things coming together so you can have that holistic view of what's happening in a session or in a transaction, and then you can create the right experience, right? If it is 85% of the time is the trusted person, then you can take them through that experience in a very nice way. You may even be able to give them other things and offers or whatever, right? But if it is fraud, then you can create some intelligent friction along the way and have the appropriate tools to do that.
I think that's interesting. We've used, Schalk, you and I, when we've chatted about this before, we've used this idea of intelligent friction. But I think every consumer has a different definition of what intelligent friction is for them, because I think sometimes consumers expect that the bank know what they're doing and not prompt something that is for their own protection. Well, at the same time, maybe they would expect a prompt but don't get it because the tools are working the way that they should. How do you think through that as a provider and enabler of those services for banks? How do you help get the balance right?
Yeah, so maybe I can jump in there, Karen. I think, in Citi, right, we have multiple parts of our business, right? I work in the institutional clients area. And what we see on the institutional client side is slightly different than what we see on the consumer side, right? So institutional clients, especially large multinational corporates, right, they're fairly sophisticated in terms of having infrastructure and security in place, right? They have larger organizations where if they're making a significant transaction, they can have approval workflows with
Yeah,
three,
sure.
4 people in the process using different devices. And so there's a certain level of maturity expected from them, and it's proportionate to the amount of transactions and large size transactions that they do, versus what an individual who may make a large transaction, maybe once in their life, to make a down payment on a purchase of a property or something like that. And so I think what we look at is how does that security and friction proportional to the risk, as well as the level of maturity of the client as well.
Schalk, what's your perspective on that?
The interesting question for me is that I'm actually thinking of lately is what is the definition of friction? We say intelligent friction, but if I've never used a mobile in my life and I'm doing a transaction, all of a sudden there's something pop up says approve this on your mobile. Where's the device? That certainly is friction. Whereas if I'm actually on my mobile doing a transaction and it's either we use a behavioral to determine it's me, and or ask authentication for some other reason while I'm on that certainly is not friction because I have it in my hand.
Right.
So I think the ultimate thing here is where this is going is combining exactly as Raj and Jill had said here. It's getting towards contextual awareness. All right. In other words, it really depends. And in our view, this is getting towards building nearly the version 2 of authentication. Version 1 was, we're going to send something or do something and, treat our entire customer base the same. And, if something fails, then we have a fallback. And then it's very easy to understand that there will be friction because not every person is the same and not every transaction is the same. As per Raj, it's a big or a small transaction. So for me, the devil is in the detail in determining contextual awareness, context-aware authentication. Who are you? Where are you from? What are you doing? What are you coming in from? And making the actual best authentication decision based on that. It's curating the authentication journey for the specific person, depending on what they're doing. That means there will never be friction, and we can always ensure that we authenticate the person with the best. But that again clashes with the discussion that we're having here. That we need a lot of data to be able to make those things. Context is key. So, I want to be able to know that you are coming in from, the PC that you normally use. I want to know that this is your device and, not think so, but know so. And, that your PC and or your authentication device and transacting device are in the same place. So there's a lot of things that actually make data powerful. And that's ultimately, what we're grappling with as well in terms of customers that don't allow all of these things, but it can actually make their lives so much easier. But to your answer, to your question rather, context-aware authentication is where I think if building up the entire way to curate the journey for the specific customer is the way to solve this.
Is there debate about that, Jill and Raj, or is it a matter of how to execute that vision?
At least from my side, I think it's really about how to execute that vision. I think from a security perspective, there's no real silver bullet that if you put a big lock on the front door, you're going to be safe from everything. It's really about layers of security, and having security at different points in time, and then taking into account the context of who the customer is, what are they trying to do, is there bigger risk, smaller risk, is there things that we need to do a high level verification, or is this more of a lower level? And so I think it's moving away from just having a very strong, complex password or one-time password. In our case that we use for institutional clients at login, it's looking at post login. What is the user doing? Is this typical for them, et cetera? And I think some of these probabilistic tools that give you context awareness and how you handle it is, I think, getting better, but I think it's still evolving. And the very nature of it, since they're probabilistic, right? They can't be 100% relied on, but they give us more intelligence so that we can get better at allowing legitimate users to do what they need to do, and potentially catch folks that are trying to do something that they shouldn't.
Yeah,
Jill?
I agree. I mean, I think it's the execution, right? Having the data, having the context, understanding to what you were mentioning, like understanding the level of risk for that situation, and then applying, the right level of, friction based on all of those things combined together. Yeah, and I do think, like, even these probabilistic, like that you mentioned before, these probabilistic indicators, having a variety of those insights, right? Like having that information, even though some of it is probabilistic, just gives you more confidence, right? And gives you more data and insight that, this is actually the real user, a good user that I want to protect through that journey, or it's a bad actor, right? That I want to potentially have that friction with. So
just a comment, sorry, apologies for that, on this, and something that Raj says is incredibly important, that I think is coming towards realization in the industry. There is no silver bullet. We over the past 10 or 15 years, there were a number of solutions, and some of these solutions are many of them are incredible and cover 99% or some very large percentage, but there's always that little, what about this use case? Behavioral, as an example, is something that I'm a really strong advocate of, but there's a use case where we get currently where somebody is actually being duped by literally it's impersonation. The so-called bank calls you and convinces you on your own device. So it's you. Behavioral will say this is you, and you're going to do it, and you're going to authorize a transaction that's coming from elsewhere. So cross-channel awareness is incredibly important for us to understand not only isolation in terms of channels, that we can see what's going on from all aspects of the transaction and curate the journey based on that. So it's getting towards a situation where we realize that there's the tools are and to get to a situation where you can make that decision that, okay, behavioral says this is Jill on a device, and but hang on, the location states that this is from pick a country not around here. Ask Jill if this really is what she wants to do. Or in certain cases, if you have reputation from certain bad actors in terms of a device, probably the transaction shouldn't even go to the customer. We should just straight up block this, because sometimes we need to protect customers from themselves. So I think we're getting to the situation where we realize that all these tools together, it's like arrows in a quiver type thing. One is good for this job, and one is armor piercing and this and that. So getting something and understanding that which tool is required and orchestrating that, and based on contextual awareness, it's actually the tools are there, as Raj had said. So it's an exciting time to actually build this out.
It's interesting, Schalk, that you bring up the cross-channel dimension, because that is something consumers increasingly do. 25% of consumers check accounts across multiple devices. And one of the things consumers expect, more than half of consumers, in fact, expect, is a consistent experience across channels, which they don't get today in many cases. So, I mean, your point about that being a vulnerability, perhaps a weak link in protecting consumers, I think is a good one. It's increasingly how consumers are managing their digital lives.
We certainly see that in certain markets, or customers or banks rather deploy literally as like standalone. This is my card channel, and I'm going to use this, and this is my internet banking channel, and I'm going to use that. And from our perspective, it must be cross-channel. If a first-time card user does a transaction online, behavioral is not going to help you if it's done in isolation, because I know nothing to compare you with. But if I've seen you on internet banking or mobile banking, then, oh yes, this is the same person. So deploying solutions cross-channel is incredibly important to actually build up that data that we can leverage and use to protect customers across, as we said earlier, fraud is not going to go away. It changes form. Sometimes I think it's kind of like energy. You can't destroy it. It just changes. So we need to ensure we have a holistic picture And that means cross-channel. Because if you stop it on one channel,
A
it
very
really
good
goes to
point
the other.
there about this kind of threat evolving and changing, right? It's a cat and mouse game. I think as we introduce better techniques for mitigating fraud, right? The fraudsters and bad actors get change their tactics and evolve. And I think it becomes something that really is a partnership between us and our clients to have not only the tools deployed and strong authentication, contextual awareness, et cetera, but also really working closely to educate and inform what we see happening out there, because there's certain things that we can control and certain things that are happening outside that we can't. And either way, there can be unfortunate consequences. So we all have a vested interest in trying to make a strong ecosystem for legitimate business to be conducted, as safely, securely, and frictionlessly as possible.
Exactly, and that's why stuff like consortium data, which the new data as an example does provide, and we rely on certain things. It's incredibly important because it means that if you see something at a different bank, you can actually protect the customer on this, because a lot of these bad actors, I mean, they don't. It's for them as a job. I'm attacking X, customers per day. I'm not going to buy a different phone for every single attack type. So there are ways, and that's why consortium data that is across industry is incredibly important to be added to this.
Yeah, and I think the other big thing is staying on top of just the trends, like for the solution providers, right? As there are, new capabilities introduced on devices, IoT devices, and linking things together, like making sure that the solutions that we offer are staying on top of that, right? And they're evolving as those capabilities are coming to fruition on the phone or the mobile devices. We're able to track new behavioral patterns and new interactions, hopefully before the fraudsters try to crack that and figure it out, right? And to your point, sharing that information across the board in the consortium, I think is really key, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point about, it's cross-channel, and today, it's online, it's mobile, but the whole digital transformation is about enabling any physical endpoint to become a connected device. So there will be many connected devices. Cars will become connected devices that enable transactions, and speakers in your home have already done that as well, with voice activated prompts. So there's just a proliferation of devices that are capable of enabling transactions. So the challenge becomes even more complex as these endpoints are introduced into the consumer's environment.
I think though that what's interesting is that I think as we have more devices and interconnectedness, I think that does create complexity, as you said, but I think it also opens up some opportunities, right? Because each device can potentially be an aid in trying to mitigate fraud risk.
Another source of intelligence.
Exactly, another source of intelligence, or another source of information and data, right? We've for our institutional banking platform, for the last 25 years, the norm has been kind of these little calculators that generate one-time passwords, right? And we've moved from that to apps that generate it, but now we've launched capabilities where if you're logging in on the desktop, you get a notification on your app. The app does your biometrics on the mobile device, and then you get logged into your phone, right? So this is, these kind of cross device communications, as well as the sensors and data and capabilities they have, create real opportunities to also strengthen your security in ways that are, faster and easier than kind of conventional older ones.
It sounds as though there's no disagreement, certainly among this group, but industry-wide, that having contextual intelligence is better for the consumer, better for the financial institution, better for the ecosystem broadly. But you all mentioned that execution is really now the task at hand. And I'm sure with that, some challenges to overcome. So as you think about the execution of what we all agree is a better way to authenticate consumers, what are the things that are on the critical path that need to be done in order to get to where I think we all agree we need to go? Jill, from your perspective, what are they?
I think it's the big things on the critical path are having the right tools, like making sure that we're capturing the right level of information and that we're sharing it across the board, right? Like that, again, kind of towards that consortium discussion that we were having before. If we can make some of that available, information and insights available across the board, that protects the whole ecosystem, right? But you got to make sure that everybody is kind of willing to participate in those things, right? So it involves getting, I think, some adoption of those things, mass adoption of those things, so that it can be more powerful for the entire ecosystem.
But isn't protecting the ecosystem the incentive to do that?
Yes, I mean, it is. I mean, but I think there's some, there could be some issues with, people wanting to share information in a consortium. They want, and they could be, issues for their particular region. They could be regulatory issues that they don't want to share some of that information. So to the degree that we can, obviously anonymize and try to put that into a system where everybody can take advantage of it, is what I am trying to articulate.
Got it. Raj, from your perspective, what's on the critical path?
I think there's a couple of things that are top of mind for us. I think one is really making sure that we are treating and managing what information we're collecting responsibly, right? We work with regulators in 90 plus markets where we operate, and there's different levels of maturity around regulatory framework, et cetera, but we also have our own internal policies on how we're managing data and what is, we are collecting what for what purpose, as well as what security is around that data, and anonymization and aggregation and things like that can be used to make sure that we protect the individual privacy and those things of that nature. But I think the devil's always in the details and how you execute and deploy these solutions in a way that it has meaning, impact, and benefit to all parties, but that you're doing it in a way that you're providing some transparency and information to legitimate users, saying, we've deployed XYZ tool, so this is being done for your protection, and so being able to do that and communicate properly, right? So sometimes we'll have alerts, so we think of something as suspicious activity, and really the important part is making sure that we are communicating that in as clear a way as possible to the legitimate individual, to let them know, hey, we see certain things, we may not have all of the information. So simple example is we may think that there's some malware, but we don't have detailed information on the individual's device to be able to say for certain it's XYZ malware, et cetera. We just may have some traces of that provide us some level of suspicion, right? So how do we communicate with that without alarming the individual, but enough that they take it seriously to conduct some due diligence? So I think those are some of the things that we're looking at on how do we deploy the solutions and execute on them appropriately.
Schalk, I'm gonna give you the last word on this, but as you think about the critical path, the angle though that I'd love for you to talk about is what will accelerate the adoption of this risk-based authentication, contextual intelligence, the way that we've been talking about it for the last half hour. What do we need?
There's a couple of things, and I think it's if you look at the solutions, surely there's, there's an execution portion, but a lot of this, already exists. Part of the problem is how banks actually buy. You certainly, and that gets to cross-channel, because what you will see is that, you have a different solution and standalone very often on card, and standalone and different solution on, mobile, and, probably also on something else. So, those kind of things mean that there's strong data points that we're not tracking, and that's not adding to this equation. So the contextual awareness is negatively impacted. And if you have standalone solutions, the user experience, it's very important what you said. From a customer perspective, I'm not seeing a different organization when I use my card versus when I actually go in on mobile banking. It's the same bank. So, I expect the same user, and I expect them to know that this is me doing this and it's the same me doing that. And, perhaps the answer is on consortium level. Perhaps it is some form of orchestration in terms of getting different vendors to talk together. And I think a lot of this will change in the next year or so. But at this stage, I think the quickest acceleration is to understand that cross-functional deployment of technologies is incredibly important to actually get towards contextual awareness. And then we also need to look at, it's device fingerprinting is probably rightly so in terms of privacy. Under attack from the browser, manufacturers, for lack of a better word, for privacy reasons. But that does also mean that, in terms of tracking and more data points towards understanding who you are, where you've been, what you've done, for pure security reasons, it becomes a problem. So if that can be solved, by providing a very strong browser ID, it will also assist us to ensure that, yes, I've seen, this person on this site, and I can leverage that data to secure them in something else, because yes, I know this is the same person. So back to behavioral, they are acting the same place. So there's a couple of these things that we need to address. Many of these things are in place, but I think at this stage, probably the biggest obstacle towards adoption, there's various phases of this. I don't think we're unfortunately going to get to consortium data across the industry anytime soon.
Right.
There's many privacy and commercial and other and probably competitive loopholes that we have to get over there. But a bank choosing the right vendor and choosing a partner and ensuring that it's cross-channel in terms of what they do can ensure that the tools are all there. FIDO, as an example, is very strong, but it's not a silver bullet. Behavioral is super strong, but there's that one small percentage perhaps chances. So, but adding the two together and adding strong device ID and adding in-app authentication, all of these things and curating that journey with the right partner actually can solve it already. Will it get better over time? I think so, and I think consortium data is the thing that we need to, if we can get to that one day, because there's certain things at this stage where a fraudster calls me, and we've seen this in certain markets, where they literally convince people to do a transfer, not a commerce transaction, a transfer from their own device. It's super hard to predict against that. Because everything will check. It's me on my device doing a transaction, tick. So yeah.
Schalk, Raj, and Jill, thanks so much for a fantastic conversation. I appreciate your time today, and look forward to continuing this conversation. We're going to check back in a year and see how much progress we've made, but hopefully we won't have to take another year before we meet again. Thanks again for your time. Bye-bye now.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.